Picture this, October 7, 2020. The Kingsbury Hall at the University of Utah. Under the blazing studio lights, two men sit 12 feet apart, separated by plexiglass barriers that somehow make the tension even more electric. 93 million Americans are glued to their screens, watching what would become one of the most jaw-dropping moments in modern political history. Vice President Mike Pence leans forward with that practiced politician's smile, his silver hair perfectly styled, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of crafting alternative realities. The moderator has just asked about the economy, and Pence sees his moment to shine. "Susan," he begins, his voice rising with theatrical conviction, "I'm proud to say that President Donald Trump has delivered the greatest economic record in American history. The greatest. In American history." The words hang in the air like a challenge thrown down at high noon. This isn't just political spin anymore, this is a man rewriting the very fabric of economic reality on live television. The audacity is breathtaking. The confidence, staggering. But across that stage, something extraordinary happens. Joe Biden doesn't flinch. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't even blink. Instead, he fixes Pence with a look that seems to peer straight through the camera and into the soul of every working family watching at home. It's the look of a man who has walked through the wreckage of actual economic collapse. Who has held the hands of unemployed workers. Who knows the difference between Wall Street numbers and Main Street pain. The silence stretches for what feels like an eternity. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. In television time, that's forever. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from coast to coast as America realizes they're witnessing something monumental. Pence shifts slightly in his chair, perhaps sensing he's just walked into something he didn't expect. But it's too late now. The gauntlet has been thrown. The lines have been drawn. This isn't just another political debate anymore. This is about to become a reckoning, a moment where carefully constructed narratives collide headfirst with inconvenient truths. Where decades of policy experience prepare to meet years of practiced deflection. But what happened next left the entire country in stunned silence. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what America looked like in October 2020. This wasn't just another election year debate, this was a nation hanging by an economic thread, desperately searching for leaders who could tell them the truth about their future. While Mike Pence sat there claiming the greatest economic record in history, the real America told a very different story. 26 million Americans were collecting unemployment benefits. 1 in 8 adults reported their household didn't have enough food. Small business owners, the backbone of communities from Detroit to Des Moines, were boarding up storefronts they'd spent lifetimes building, watching their American dreams crumble in real time. Maria Gonzalez in Phoenix had just closed her family restaurant after 37 years. The same week as this debate, she was staring at foreclosure notices, wondering how she'd tell her children that everything their grandparents had sacrificed for was gone. David Chen in Milwaukee was rationing his diabetes medication because his manufacturing job disappeared overnight. Sarah Williams in Tampa was choosing between rent and groceries, despite working 2 jobs that used to be one person's full-time career. But here's the twisted irony that made Pence's claim so jarring: while Main Street America was drowning, Wall Street was literally hitting record highs. The Dow Jones had just crossed 28,000 for the first time in months. Tech billionaires were adding zeros to their net worth while teachers were driving for DoorDash to pay rent. The disconnect wasn't just economic, it was moral. This is what made this debate moment so crucial. It wasn't about Republican versus Democrat. It wasn't about red states versus blue states. This was about 2 fundamentally different understandings of what economic success actually means. Does it mean stock prices, or does it mean whether working families can afford to live with dignity? Does it mean GDP growth, or does it mean whether small business owners can sleep at night without panic attacks about bankruptcy? Joe Biden understood this distinction in his bones. As vice president during the 2008 financial crisis, he had seen what real economic collapse looks like. He had crafted policies that pulled America back from the brink of depression. More importantly, he had looked unemployed workers in the eye and promised them that better days were coming, and then delivered on that promise. Mike Pence, on the other hand, had inherited the longest economic expansion in American history and somehow managed to break it within 4 years. Yet here he was, with the supreme confidence of a man who had never missed a meal, telling struggling families that they were living through the greatest economy ever. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Millions of Americans were watching this debate while sitting at kitchen tables covered with unpaid bills, wondering if their government even understood their reality. They needed someone who would fight for them, not gaslight them. Someone who would acknowledge their pain, not dismiss it with statistics that felt like slaps in the face. Biden knew all of this as he sat there, letting Pence dig his own rhetorical grave with every word. The former vice president wasn't just preparing a political response, he was preparing to speak for every family that had been forgotten by an administration that measured success by the wealth of the wealthy rather than the welfare of workers. What happens next changes everything about how America sees economic leadership. To understand how Mike Pence could sit on that debate stage and claim the greatest economic record in American history with a straight face, you have to understand the man himself, a politician who had perfected the art of taking credit for other people's work and calling it leadership. Michael Richard Pence didn't build anything. He inherited everything. When Trump selected him as vice president in 2016, Pence walked into an economy that Barack Obama and Joe Biden had spent 8 grueling years rebuilding from the ashes of the Great Recession. Unemployment had already fallen from 10% to 4.7%. The stock market had already tripled. Manufacturing was already adding jobs. The longest economic expansion in American history was already well underway. But here's where Pence's political genius, and moral blindness, revealed itself. Instead of acknowledging this inherited prosperity, he immediately began crafting a narrative where he and Trump were the economic saviors of America. Month after month, rally after rally, interview after interview, Pence polished his talking points until they gleamed like fool's gold. Jobs, 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 became his mantra. And technically, he wasn't lying, jobs were being created. What he conveniently omitted was that the rate of job creation had actually slowed under Trump compared to Obama's final years. But Pence had mastered the politician's greatest trick, telling partial truths that created complete illusions. He would stand before cheering crowds in Indiana and Michigan, his voice rising with evangelical fervor, proclaiming how Trump's policies had unleashed American prosperity. The crowds would roar. The cameras would capture his confident smile. And working families would go home to the same stagnant wages they'd been earning for decades. Because here's what Mike Pence never mentioned in those soaring speeches: while he was celebrating job creation, wages for working Americans had barely budged. While he was praising the blue-collar boom, manufacturing workers were still making less in real terms than they had in 1980. While he was touting the stock market, 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. Pence had perfected the art of economic gaslighting. He could make a family earning $40,000 a year feel ungrateful for not appreciating the greatest economy ever, while their grocery bills climbed and their health insurance premiums soared. He could celebrate tax cuts for corporations while teachers were spending their own money on school supplies. He could praise deregulation while coal miners died from preventable accidents and water systems failed in working-class communities. The most maddening part wasn't just his disconnect from working-class reality, it was his supreme confidence in his own narrative. Pence genuinely seemed to believe that economic success could be measured entirely by numbers that sounded good in speeches, regardless of whether those numbers translated into actual prosperity for actual families. His Indiana governorship had followed the same pattern. Pence inherited a relatively stable state economy, implemented a few business-friendly policies, and then spent years taking credit for trends that had started before he arrived. When manufacturing jobs left Indiana, he blamed global forces. When they came back, he credited his leadership. It was a masterclass in selective attribution. By 2020, this approach had reached its logical conclusion. Even as the pandemic exposed every weakness in an economy built on financial engineering rather than fundamental strength, Pence doubled down. Even as unemployment spiked to levels not seen since the Great Depression, he insisted that Trump's pre-pandemic economy proved their superior leadership. Even as small businesses collapsed by the tens of thousands, he celebrated the resilience of large corporations. But perhaps most tellingly, Pence seemed genuinely shocked when anyone questioned his narrative. He had spent 4 years surrounded by advisors who confirmed his worldview, donors who benefited from his policies, and audiences who cheered his every word. The possibility that his economic story might not match the lived experience of struggling families seemed to genuinely confuse him. This was the man who sat across from Joe Biden that October night, radiating the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to choose between rent and groceries. This was the politician who had built his career on inheriting other people's successes and claiming them as his own triumphs. He had no idea he was about to face someone who understood the difference between economic statistics and economic reality. Someone who had actually built recovery from the ground up. But across the stage stood someone who had lived through America's economic storms before. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. learned about economic hardship not from policy briefings or campaign consultants, but from watching his father's hands shake as he explained why they had to move away from everything they'd ever known. It was 1952 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. 10-year-old Joe Biden watched his father, Joseph Sr., struggle to find steady work selling cars in a town where the manufacturing jobs were disappearing and families like theirs were hanging on by threads. The Bidens weren't poor, but they weren't secure either. They lived in that precarious space where one bad month could mean losing everything. When his father finally found opportunity in Delaware, young Joe learned his first lesson about economic reality. Sometimes survival means leaving behind the place that shaped you. The family packed everything they owned into a car and drove away from Scranton, but Scranton never left Joe Biden's heart. More importantly, the economic anxiety that forced that move never left his political soul. This wasn't theoretical for Biden. This was personal. Throughout his childhood, he watched his father work multiple jobs, rebuild their stability, and maintain his dignity even when times were toughest. Joseph Sr. taught his son a lesson that would define his entire approach to economic policy. A job is about more than just a paycheck, it's about dignity, purpose, and the ability to look your children in the eye and tell them everything will be okay. When Biden arrived in the U.S. Senate in 1973 at age 30, he didn't come as another privileged politician playing with other people's lives. He came as someone who understood that behind every economic statistic was a family sitting around a kitchen table, trying to make the numbers work. He had been that child listening to those conversations. For decades, Biden built his reputation as the senator who actually understood working families. When manufacturing jobs fled the Rust Belt, he didn't just offer thoughts and prayers, he crafted legislation to retrain workers and attract new industries. When healthcare costs started bankrupting middle-class families, he didn't just blame market forces, he fought for reforms that would make treatment affordable. When the minimum wage stagnated while corporate profits soared, he didn't just celebrate job creation, he demanded that jobs pay enough for workers to live with dignity. But it was the 2008 financial crisis that truly tested everything Biden had learned about economic leadership. When Barack Obama asked him to be vice president, America was hemorrhaging 700,000 jobs per month. The banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. Automakers were preparing for bankruptcy. Families who had played by the rules their entire lives were watching their homes foreclosed and their retirement savings evaporate. It was economic catastrophe on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. This is when Joe Biden's Scranton roots became America's salvation. While other politicians debated abstract economic theories, Biden focused on the human reality. He understood that economic recovery wasn't just about stabilizing banks, it was about making sure that the recovery reached the families who had suffered the most. He didn't just want to save Wall Street, he demanded that any rescue include Main Street. Biden became the point person for implementing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the largest economic stimulus package in American history at that time. But here's what made Biden different from typical Washington politicians: he didn't just write the checks and declare victory. He traveled the country, visiting factory floors and community centers, looking workers in the eye and promising them that this investment would create real jobs for real people. And it worked. Under Biden's watchful oversight, the Recovery Act created or saved millions of jobs while maintaining unprecedented transparency and accountability. Unlike the Wall Street bailouts that enriched executives, Biden ensured that recovery dollars went to infrastructure projects that employed construction workers, education programs that kept teachers in classrooms, and clean energy initiatives that created entirely new industries. More than that, Biden understood something that career politicians often miss: people needed to see that their government was fighting for them, not just fighting the crisis. He held regular meetings with mayors and governors, making sure federal resources reached communities that needed them most. He became the face of an administration that didn't just talk about caring for working families, it proved it through action. By the time Biden left the vice presidency in 2017, he had helped oversee the longest economic expansion in American history. Unemployment had fallen from 10% to under 5%. The auto industry had been saved and transformed. Millions of Americans had gained access to affordable healthcare. The recovery hadn't just been about numbers, it had been about restoring the fundamental promise that hard work should lead to a decent life. But Biden's economic expertise went deeper than policy success. It was rooted in moral clarity about what the economy should serve. He believed that economic policy should be measured not by stock prices or GDP growth, but by whether working families could afford to send their kids to college, whether small business owners could dream of expansion, whether seniors could retire with dignity. This was the man sitting across from Mike Pence that October night. Not a politician reciting talking points, but someone who had lived economic hardship, crafted economic recovery, and delivered economic hope to millions of Americans who had been forgotten by the powerful. And as Pence began his economic victory lap, Biden knew exactly what he had to do. Mike Pence was hitting his stride now, and he knew it. Fresh off his opening salvo about the greatest economic record in American history, the vice president leaned into his performance with the confidence of a man who had delivered this same speech to adoring crowds across America for 4 years. His voice grew stronger, more animated, his gestures more emphatic as he began rattling off his greatest hits. "We've created over 6 million jobs," Pence declared, his index finger stabbing the air for emphasis. "We've seen the lowest unemployment rate for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans in recorded history." He paused for effect, letting that sink in, his political instincts telling him this was landing exactly as intended. The camera caught Biden's reaction, or rather, his deliberate lack of reaction. While Pence performed, Biden simply listened, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. Not furious scribbling, not frantic preparation, just methodical, patient note-taking. The kind of note someone takes when they're cataloging errors that need correcting. But Pence was just getting warmed up. "We rebuilt our military, we revived American manufacturing," he continued, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. "We achieved energy independence for the first time in 70 years. Each claim rolled off his tongue with practiced precision, polished through countless campaign rallies and Fox News interviews. You could see the confidence building in Pence's posture. He straightened in his chair, his gestures became more expansive, his smile more assured. This was his element, the carefully controlled environment where his talking points could flow uninterrupted, where complex economic realities could be reduced to applause lines. "We cut taxes across the board," Pence pressed on, now fully animated. "We rolled back the heavy hand of government regulation that was stifling American businesses and American workers." His voice carried that special politician's conviction, the kind that comes from believing your own press releases. Meanwhile, Biden remained perfectly still, his expression neutral but his eyes never leaving Pence's face. Occasionally, he would glance down at his notes, add another line, then return his attention to the vice president's performance. There was something almost unsettling about his composure, the calm of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, or a chess master watching an opponent make exactly the wrong move. Pence seemed energized by Biden's silence, interpreting it as validation rather than calculation. "We've negotiated trade deals that put American workers first," he declared with growing enthusiasm. "The USMCA, Phase 1 of our trade deal with China, these are victories for the American people that the previous administration said couldn't be done. The moderator tried to interject, to move the conversation forward, but Pence was in full flow now. This was his moment, his chance to cement the economic narrative that had defined the Trump-Pence administration. He had the stage, he had the statistics, and he had what he believed was a winning argument. We've seen wages rise faster for blue-collar workers than white-collar workers for the first time in decades, Pence continued, his voice now carrying the rhythmic cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. We've seen manufacturing jobs come roaring back, jobs that the previous administration said would require a magic wand to bring back. That last line drew a slight reaction from Biden, not anger, but what looked almost like amusement. A barely perceptible shake of the head, so subtle that only the most careful observers would have caught it. But it was there, a tiny crack in the composed facade that suggested something was building beneath the surface. Pence, however, was too caught up in his own momentum to notice. He was performing at his peak, delivering his economic gospel with the passion of someone who truly believed he was winning this exchange. The statistics were on his side, the achievements were real, the victories were documented. What he didn't realize was that he was digging himself deeper into a hole with every word, setting himself up for a reckoning that would expose the difference between political theater and economic reality. What happened next left the entire country in stunned silence. When Joe Biden finally spoke, his voice was so calm it was almost conversational. But there was steel underneath that conversational tone, the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. Mike, Biden began, looking directly at Pence with those steady blue eyes, you inherited the longest economic expansion in American history, and you broke it. The words landed like a precision strike. Simple. Devastating. Undeniable. Pence's confident smile flickered for just a moment, barely perceptible, but the camera caught it. That tiny crack in his political armor that revealed he knew exactly what was coming next. Biden wasn't done. Not even close. Let's talk about those job numbers you're so proud of, Biden continued, his voice never rising above that conversational level, which somehow made every word more powerful. In the last 3 years of the Obama-Biden administration, we created more jobs than you did in your first 3 years. We handed you an economy that was adding 220,000 jobs per month, and you slowed it down to 180,000. The specificity was brutal. These weren't campaign talking points, these were numbers that told a story Pence had hoped would never be told on national television. You want to talk about unemployment rates? Biden pressed on, and now you could see him finding his rhythm, decades of policy expertise flowing through every syllable. We cut unemployment in half during our 8 years in office. We took it from 10% down to 4.7%. You took credit for riding that wave we created. Pence tried to interject, but Biden's momentum was unstoppable now. This wasn't a political performance, this was a master class in economic reality delivered by someone who had lived through the actual work of recovery. And manufacturing? You say jobs came roaring back. Biden's voice carried just a hint of incredulity, the tone of a teacher correcting a student who hadn't done the homework. Manufacturing job growth was higher in the last 3 years of our administration than in your first 3 years. We added 185,000 manufacturing jobs. You added 170,000. Before the pandemic. Each fact landed like a hammer blow. You could see Pence shifting in his seat, his earlier confidence evaporating as the statistical foundation of his economic narrative crumbled in real time. But then Biden did something that transformed this from a policy debate into something far more powerful. He made it personal. You know what really gets me, Mike? Biden leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that made millions of viewers feel like he was speaking directly to them. You stand there and talk about the greatest economy in history while people are losing their homes. While parents are choosing between paying rent and buying groceries for their kids. The camera captured something extraordinary in that moment. Biden's face transformed from policy wonk to moral witness, channeling the pain of every family he'd met who had been left behind by an economy that worked for Wall Street but failed Main Street. I've been in those homes, Mike. I've sat at those kitchen tables. I've looked into the eyes of parents who are terrified they can't provide for their children. And you want to call that the greatest economy in history? Pence tried to respond, but his voice seemed smaller now, less certain. Joe, the unemployment rate was falling before you got there. Biden's voice rose for the first time, not in anger but in passionate clarity. We gave you the tools for success, and you squandered them. We gave you the longest expansion in American history, and you turned it into chaos. The audience was completely silent now. Even the moderator seemed stunned by the systematic demolition taking place. This wasn't typical political back and forth, this was one person who had actually done the work of economic recovery facing someone who had simply taken credit for inherited success. But Biden saved his most devastating blow for last. And then, he said, his voice returning to that calm, conversational tone that somehow made every word cut deeper, when the real test came, when America needed real leadership during the pandemic, what did you do? You failed. You completely and utterly failed. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath from viewers across America as they processed what they had just witnessed. 26 million Americans are on unemployment right now, Mike. 26 million. Small businesses are closing forever. People are dying not just from COVID, but from the economic devastation that your administration's incompetence created. And you have the audacity to sit there and call it the greatest economy in history? Pence's face had gone pale. The supremely confident politician who had begun this exchange was nowhere to be found, replaced by someone who looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Biden leaned back in his chair, his point made, his case closed. But his final words carried the weight of moral authority that no amount of political spin could match. The American people deserve better than lies, Mike. They deserve leaders who will tell them the truth about their struggles and fight like hell to make their lives better. That's what we did for 8 years. That's what real economic leadership looks like. The moderator tried to move on to the next question, but you could feel that the entire trajectory of the debate had shifted. The carefully constructed economic narrative that had carried the Trump-Pence administration for 4 years had just been dismantled, fact by fact, lie by lie, in front of the entire nation. Pence attempted a weak response about resilience and recovery, but the damage was done. The emperor's economic clothes had been removed, and everyone could see the naked truth underneath. The explosion of reaction was immediate and unprecedented. Within minutes of Biden's devastating takedown, the internet exploded. Twitter was the first to catch fire. The phrase, "you broke it," started trending before the debate had even ended, with the clip of Biden's calm but crushing delivery being shared thousands of times per minute. The hashtag economic truth shot to #1 trending nationwide, as Americans who had been gaslit about their own financial struggles for 4 years suddenly had the language to express what they'd been feeling all along. At Economic Policy 202 tweeted, Biden just delivered the most devastating fact check in debate history. Every number was perfect. Every comparison was accurate. This is what happens when expertise meets propaganda. The tweet got 127,000 retweets in the first hour. But it wasn't just political Twitter that was losing its mind. Regular Americans, the ones who had been told their economic anxiety was unpatriotic, that questioning the greatest economy ever made them ungrateful, were finally seeing someone with credibility validate their reality. Maria Santos, a teacher from Phoenix, posted a video that would go viral within hours. "I'm crying watching this. For 4 years they told us we were wrong to worry about making ends meet. Biden just proved we weren't crazy. We were being lied to." Her video got shared 50,000 times by midnight. The reaction on cable news was equally explosive. CNN's economic analyst immediately called it the most effective economic debate performance in modern political history. MSNBC brought on 3 former Obama economic advisors who spent 20 minutes breaking down each of Biden's statistics, confirming every single number he had cited. Even more telling was the reaction from economists themselves. Dr. Mark Zandi from Moody's Analytics, who had advised both Republican and Democratic administrations, tweeted, "Biden's economic takedown of Pence was flawless. Every statistic was accurate. Every comparison was valid." This is what happens when someone who actually built economic recovery debates someone who just inherited it. Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman was even more direct, "I've fact-checked every claim Biden made tonight. They're all correct." Meanwhile, Pence's "greatest economy in history" claim isn't just wrong, it's historically illiterate. The international reaction was swift and telling. The BBC led their morning coverage with, "Biden demolishes Pence on economy," while The Guardian ran the headline, "American Vice President Schooled on Basic Economics by Former VP." German economic newspaper Handelsblatt called it, "a masterclass in how to counter economic disinformation." But perhaps most importantly, ordinary working families were finally seeing their struggles reflected in mainstream political discourse. The debate clip became a cultural phenomenon not because it was good politics, but because it was validating truth. Facebook groups for small business owners shared the video constantly. Finally, someone who gets it, posted Jake Morrison, who had closed his restaurant in Ohio just weeks earlier. Biden understands that the economy isn't the stock market. It's whether families like mine can survive. The ripple effects extended far beyond social media. Focus groups conducted immediately after the debate showed unprecedented movement among suburban voters, particularly women who had been struggling economically but told they should be grateful for the booming economy. Democratic strategists called it a realignment moment, the instant when millions of Americans realized their lived experience wasn't a personal failing but a policy failure. Republican economists scrambled to defend Pence's performance, but their responses only made things worse. When Heritage Foundation analysts tried to dispute Biden's jobs numbers, they were immediately fact-checked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own data, making it clear that even conservative think tanks couldn't counter Biden's mathematical precision. The most viral moment came when someone created a split-screen video showing Pence's confident boasts followed immediately by Biden's calm factual rebuttals. Set to dramatic music, it became the political video of the year, shared across every platform and viewed by millions who hadn't even watched the original debate. Late-night comedy shows had a field day. Stephen Colbert's opening monologue the next night began, "Folks, we witnessed a murder last night. And the weapon was math." The audience erupted in applause that lasted nearly 2 minutes. But beyond the memes and the viral moments, something profound had happened. For the first time in years, economic truth had broken through the noise of political spin. Americans who had been told their struggles were imaginary finally had someone with unimpeachable credentials telling them they were right to be concerned. The debate didn't just change the political conversation, it changed how millions of Americans understood their own economic reality. But beyond the viral moments and media coverage, this debate revealed something profound about American leadership. What happened in that debate wasn't just a political victory, it was a revelation about what real economic leadership looks like in America. Joe Biden didn't demolish Mike Pence's arguments because he was a better debater or had better talking points. He demolished them because he understood something fundamental that Pence never grasped: economic policy isn't about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about the dreams and dignity of real families trying to build better lives for their children. Think about the contrast we witnessed that night. On one side, you had a politician who measured success by statistics that sounded impressive in speeches but had no connection to the lived reality of working Americans. Pence could rattle off unemployment rates and GDP growth with evangelical fervor, but he couldn't explain why those numbers didn't translate into families feeling secure about their futures. On the other side, you had a leader who understood that behind every economic statistic was a human story. When Biden talked about job creation, he wasn't just citing Bureau of Labor Statistics data, he was remembering the faces of auto workers in Detroit who thought their careers were over until the Recovery Act gave them hope again. When he discussed manufacturing, he wasn't just comparing numerical trends, he was thinking about communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania where factory closures had devastated entire towns. This is the difference between authentic economic leadership and political performance art. Real leaders don't just inherit good times and take credit for them, they understand that their job is to shepherd America through the inevitable storms that come. They know that economic stewardship means being prepared not just for the easy years when everything is growing, but for the hard years when families are struggling and need someone who will fight for them. Biden's Scranton roots weren't just a campaign talking point, they were the moral foundation of his economic worldview. He understood that a healthy economy isn't one where the wealthy get wealthier while working families fall behind. It's one where a parent can work full-time and afford rent, where small business owners can dream of expansion instead of just survival, where young people can envision a future better than their parents' past. The devastating power of Biden's response came from this moral clarity. When he said, "You inherited the longest economic expansion in history and broke it," he wasn't just making a statistical argument, he was making a character argument. He was pointing out that taking credit for inherited success while failing during real crisis isn't leadership, it's the opposite of leadership. True economic leadership requires both competence and empathy. You need to understand the complex mechanics of monetary policy, trade relationships, and fiscal stimulus. But you also need to understand what it feels like to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. You need to know how to craft legislation that creates jobs, but you also need to care whether those jobs pay enough for workers to live with dignity. This is why Biden's debate performance resonated so powerfully with ordinary Americans. They weren't just watching someone win a political argument, they were watching someone defend their reality against 4 years of gaslighting. They were seeing a leader who understood that economic policy should serve families, not the other way around. The lesson transcends politics and party affiliation. In times of crisis, America needs leaders who have been tested by real challenges and emerged with both wisdom and compassion. We need people who understand that governing isn't about claiming credit for good times, it's about having the experience, empathy, and expertise to guide the nation through whatever storms may come. Biden's response that night embodied everything we should demand from our economic leaders: the courage to tell hard truths, the competence to back up those truths with facts, and the compassion to remember that behind every economic policy are millions of families counting on us to get it right. That's not just good politics, that's the kind of moral leadership America deserves, especially in our darkest hours. This is why moments like these matter, they strip away the spin and reveal the truth about who our leaders really are. That October night in Utah, America witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when truth cut through spin so clearly that it literally left the country speechless. But more than that, we saw a preview of the choice that would define our nation's future. On one side stood the politics of inherited privilege, leaders who take credit for other people's work, who mistake stock market gains for economic justice, who can look at struggling families and call their pain the greatest economy in history. This is leadership that sounds confident but crumbles under scrutiny, that offers talking points instead of solutions. On the other side stood the politics of earned wisdom, leadership forged in the fires of real crisis, tempered by genuine understanding of working-class struggle, strengthened by the hard work of actually building recovery from the ground up. This is leadership that doesn't just sound good in speeches, but delivers results for the families who need them most. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Empty rhetoric versus authentic experience. Inherited success versus earned expertise. Political theater versus moral clarity. Joe Biden's devastating takedown of Mike Pence wasn't just a debate victory, it was a masterclass in what real economic leadership looks like. It showed us what's possible when we demand leaders who understand both the spreadsheets and the human stories behind them. But here's the thing, moments like these only matter if we learn from them. If we demand this same level of honesty, competence, and empathy from every leader who asks for our trust. We can't settle for politicians who gaslight us about our struggles or take credit for trends they didn't create. America deserves leaders who will fight for economic justice, not just economic statistics. Leaders who measure success by whether families can thrive, not just whether markets can soar. The choice has never been clearer. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Subscribe if you believe America deserves authentic economic leadership. Share this video if you're ready to demand better. Because democracy works best when we refuse to accept anything less than the truth.